What weapons would medieval knights and soldiers have actually used against fantastical monsters like dragons and giant snails and giants and manticores and griffons and things like that, if they had actually existed? Well, rather than me just making this up, why don't we actually look at some of the medieval source material? What do the medieval sources say about how to fight against giant fantastical creatures? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, you may have seen that I was on IGN earlier looking at the new game Monster Hunter Wilds. And in this game there are these giant weapons and special armour that's used to fight and hunt these giant great creatures like dragons and manticores and things like that. Now, the thing is that these creatures, a lot of these creatures, are actually in the medieval bestiary. They're in the medieval fantasy world. So when we look at medieval manuscripts, and usually we're looking at the swords or the armour or the poleaxes or whatever it is, sometimes the clothing, very often they're actually set within a fantasy world, because in something like the Romance of Alexander or various other sort of myths and legends that are in these medieval manuscripts, they have fantasy creatures. So we actually have source material from the Middle Ages showing us the equipment, tactics and weapons that the medieval people themselves thought they would use against these creatures. So what do we learn from this? Well, I actually started researching for this video wanting to show you lots of really cool fantastical weapons as an illustration of how there are essentially fantasy weapons in real historical sources. And there are. I'm not going to argue that there aren't. However, what I quickly found, and rather disappointingly for me initially, was that there aren't many fantasy weapons shown. Most of the weapons shown are just normal weapons. I was expecting to see giant swords with hugely long blades and lots of spikes and wavy blades, and huge great pole arms with blades on both ends and things like this, and I didn't really find it. I found a few wacky things like these two-handed sort of cleaver falchion things, but for all we know they were real weapons. Or were they? It's difficult to say. But what I did find, as I say, was normal weapons and equipment. Normal spears and swords, axes, maces, things like godendag, poleaxes, all of the typical things that we would see for that period. If it's 13th, 14th, 15th century, whatever, we would see the normal weapons and armour that we would normally see in a historical battlefield situation being used against monsters. So it started to become really evident to me that these medieval people making these manuscripts, and for the most part these would have been artists and clergy people, clergymen and in some cases women, making manuscripts for the nobility to show these fantasy scenes from their imagined past or the Bible or sort of Greek myth or Roman myths and legends. What they showed actually was standard military equipment of the day. However, there were some things which were notable. The first thing is, against these fantastical creatures, there was a not universal but a very common theme of using numbers of people. So if you've got a large creature of some sort, you know, griffon or manticore or something, then you would get a group of soldiers to fight it. You wouldn't usually do it individually. There are, of course, famous exceptions to this, and if we look at some of the Arthurian myths, certain heroes like Lancelot or Arthur himself or Galahad went and defeated these fantastical fantasy opponents single-handedly, and that was the hero's thing to do. And of course, a famous example, of course, also is St. George himself slaying the dragon, which we'll come back to in a second. So sometimes it was an individual hero, but very often in these scenes it's a group of soldiers fighting against this external threat. But something else that's evident is usually we are looking at knights, should we call them, men-at-arms, people in full armour. When you really think about it, most creatures in our real world become drastically less dangerous if you've got armour on, okay? There were literally bear hunting suits of armour made in the 16th century. So once you put armour on, a shark, for example, can't bite you. You know, we have mail suits, chainmail suits for handling sharks. You can put bear-proof to a level armour on. you're pretty much completely impervious to something like wolves with armour on. So if we scale that up, obviously giant, massive creatures might have a huge amount of force and momentum, which the armour might not necessarily protect you against, but you are hugely more formidable in armour than out of armour, and you're much less fragile, you're not able to be bitten, you're not able to be scratched, you're immune to stinging weapons, all of that kind of stuff. So armour is an absolute game changer, as indeed is numerical superiority, as mentioned. And of course we can extrapolate this to superior tactics and technology. In some cases we can use weapons of war like siege weapons, ballista, trebuchet, catapult, things like this. We can make machines or war wagons or chariots and things like this. And of course we can use superior tactics like digging traps or creating fortifications. So we are obviously, even in a fantasy setting, most of these fantasy creatures are not as clever as humans. So we've got superior intelligence and therefore superior technology. And one specific theme I saw coming up, particularly around the many, many representations of St. George, are horsepower. Now, when you put an armoured person on a horse, they now have a huge amount more potential to injure a large opponent. The power of the lance. So driving home with the couched lance in armour on a horse has way more energy delivery to the target than you can achieve with hand swung weapons, for example, because you've got the mass and the power of the horse added to the human. And so we see that time and time again in medieval and Renaissance art, with St. George slaying the dragon, and the initial blow is pretty much always shown being given from horseback, even if he subsequently then dismounts to finish it off. Another theme I found in the medieval art, which I wasn't really expecting actually, was examples of using these fantasy creatures, not just seeing them as opponents to be defeated, killed, in some cases cooked and eaten, but actually harnessing them. We literally see things like griffons and giant eagles being harnessed and used, in some cases, even to fly. And why wouldn't you? I mean, anybody who's played Warhammer or looked at, read things like Lord of the Rings and stuff, well, if there were giant eagles, if there were griffons and hippogriffs and things like this, you would try and train them, wouldn't you? You'd try and train them and use them. And this is another theme. We see in our world, obviously, we're used to things like horses and dogs being used in everyday life, but also in war. But elephants were used. Remember that elephants were used by multiple different civilizations, not just Hannibal, but, obviously the Indian civilizations, various of them made extensive use of elephants. In fact, elephants are still used as essentially vehicles in parts of India in the building industry. They were also used by the Persians and various others. So elephants were used. So anything that was akin to an elephant, so very large and trainable, whether it could fly or not, you would try and use it, wouldn't you? And the medieval people were very aware of that. So if they had access to those creatures, they would have done that. So to conclude, looking at the actual medieval source material, rather than just making up a fantasy out of my head or based on things games I've played or books I've read, if we actually look at the medieval source material, we can see that medieval people did think about this. They literally did think, how would we defeat a dragon? How would we defeat giants or giant snails or griffons or whatever, harpies? And we see this in medieval art, and for the most part, they just use their standard gear. They use their standard armour, their standard weapons, but they coordinate into a group. They use superior intelligence and tactics. And I think they realised, and we should realise and remind ourselves, that all of these fantasy creatures aside, humans are freaking scary and OP, especially when wearing armour with sharp pointy weapons. So, moral of the story, don't over-glorify the power and terror of these fantasy creatures. Remember, you and me, we are the scariest creatures in the real world, and we probably would be the scariest creatures in the fantasy world as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and have a good weekend, and I will see you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.